All right, now the biggest challenge to global sustainability comes from economic growth. Because we all want two things: not to overheat or drown from climate change, but also get wealthier. Wealthier people are responsible for more carbon emissions. So, as more people get wealthier, that drives climate change. To understand or to analyze sustainable growth requires understanding economic growth. Now, economic growth remains weird in the sense of being highly unusual. Overall, human existence and history. The beginning of the Common Era, 2,000 years ago, the average income per person in the whole world was maybe $500 a year in today's money. After more than 1,800 years, it had grown to maybe $750 per person, which was substantial growth in living standards, but people were still extremely poor. And then, boom, the Industrial Revolution changed the trajectory of human society. Not everywhere. Started at only one remote edge, and certainly not quickly. In his book, Brad DeLong estimates that real improvements to standards of living only began after maybe 1870 or so, as economic growth really took off. Now, economic growth comes with specialization. So, for instance, in poor countries, agriculture might contribute 25% to GDP, whereas in wealthier places, that's less than 5%. My grandparents grew up on a farm, and that's true for a lot of people. But nowadays, most of you probably don't even know a farmer. But economist Partha Dasgupta points out that means ecology is of direct concern to the world's poor in a way that it just isn't to the world's rich. So let's go a little deeper into the amazing progress in human happiness due to global capitalism. I like this thread from economist Dina Pomerantz, shared some of the good news of the last decade. The global fraction of people in extreme poverty, with less than $1.90 per day, was cut in half from 22% to a little over 10%. The fraction of children dying before age 5 dropped by a third, from almost 6% to 3.6%. Life expectancy rose over the entire world from 69.5 to 72.6. Population growth slowed and is projected to level off. Primary school completion rose for both boys and girls. Now, of course, climate change is still a huge problem, and there are a lot of other things that need to change. Another economist, Max Rosen, summarized, "The world is much better. The world is awful. The world can be much better." We should take hope from all the changes we see as we figure out the changes that still need to be made. All these growth facts are encouraging, but obviously still not good enough. Now, for things like the fraction of people in extreme poverty or fraction of children dying before age 5, I want both of those as low as possible, and we're not there yet. But there's been an incredible rate of progress. Here, for instance, we have a graph of GDP per capita in 1950 on the horizontal axis, and in 2016 on the vertical axis. And this is real dollars adjusted for inflation and purchasing power. We can see most countries in the world, with a few exceptions, are above the diagonal. They got substantially richer. These are in log points, so that's also, really quite substantially changes. There are some countries doing worse, and if you squint and read the labels, you probably understand the reasons for those few. But the global average income grew by a factor of 4.4, while world population increased by a factor of 3, so there are more people who are richer on average. Today, the average person on the planet is as rich as the average person in the very richest country was back in 1950. Which is a long time ago, before I was born, but there are plenty of people alive who remember time in 1950. Today, the average person on the planet is really rich by any historical standard. Now, we don't have a lot of good data for further back in history, but as far as anyone can tell, by 1950, people were richer than humans had ever been. We didn't evolve to be this rich, so at some level, it's not really surprising that a lot of people have difficulties understanding how rich people have gotten. Now, maybe you're saying money isn't everything, and you're right. So here's data on Human Development Index, HDI. That includes GDP, life expectancy, access to education. It's broader than just looking at GDP. The data go back to 1870, so for almost 150 years, the U.S. was the best off by HDI index, but recently we've lost the lead to countries like South Korea or Taiwan, which have higher life expectancy and access to education. You see others such as the UK, which once long ago was in the lead, but has slipped significantly. Now, obviously, this is not all the countries in the world, just a selection. I've highlighted China, Brazil, Mexico, Dominican Republic, so you can see they've made substantial improvements. You can trace across horizontally where China is now to see they're approximately where the US was in 1950-ish. Now, the typical person in China is a lot poorer than the typical person in the US right now, but on the other hand, you compare to the US historically, there's enormous progress. And we see countries like Botswana and India growing significantly very quickly. So there's a lot of scope to be optimistic about economic growth. But also their emissions of CO2, carbon dioxide. The basic problem here is most people don't emit much carbon dioxide, or at least poor people don't, and poor people make very little contribution to climate change. But most poor people don't want to be poor. They want to be richer, which is understandable. More money brings a lot of good things. Kids less likely to die. But as people get more income, they pollute more. Not just carbon dioxide, lots of other pollutants as well. Climate change is a result of progress in solving the big problem of poverty in the world. We're solving one problem while creating another. Can't give up. Technological progress will help. For centuries, rich people burned more coal, but now we're making progress figuring out low carbon methods of generating, heat, light, power, all those good things.